Hello and welcome to Music and Art in the Catholic Tradition, Module 1, Lesson 4. Today we're going to be talking about ancient art and ancient music. We're going to be looking back on the music and art of the previous lessons that we didn't get to talk about in previous lectures because there was so much reading to talk about. And we're just going to look just sort of overall at ancient art and ancient music and relate it back to the readings and ask some questions about it, see whether or not it matches up with the readings or whether this is a case of authors writing something, thinkers thinking something that the practical artisans and performers, musicians just weren't doing. So, let's get started with ancient art. Now, you'll notice in a lot of the pieces of art that we've looked at in the videos, the YouTube videos for past lessons, that contrary to what might be the popular assumption about Greek and Roman art, it was actually very similar to the art we get in the Renaissance. And of course that makes sense because the art in the Renaissance is a rebirth of Greek and Roman art. Yes, we see in Greece, we see vase paintings that are very two-dimensional and unrealistic, but we also see, which may come as a surprise when we look at some of these pieces of art, the painting especially that survived from Greece, a real focus on realism. And this also occurs in their sculpture, of which we have a lot more than their paintings. And the same goes for the Romans as well. We have a lot more of their sculptures than we do of their paintings, just because paintings tend to be less permanent. And so, as I said, they're focusing on and have a real care for realism. So, what is it that's driving this realism? Well, let's ask the question, was realism important for Plato and Aristotle? And of course, if we look back and we think about it, we could say, yes, realism is very important for them because that ties into fittingness. You know, as we said, Plato and Aristotle both believed that things should be fitting, that artistic representations, in order to be beautiful, need to be fitting imitations, as Aristotle would say, fitting imitations of the thing that they are imitating, of the thing that they're representing. Or, as Plato would say, a fitting, very close, if not exact, because, of course, they can't ever be exact, but as close to exact, as close to perfect as you can get of a representation of a form. So, the most beautiful painting of a person would be not only realistic in the sense that it represents that person, but also it would evoke some connection, deeper connection to the form of the person, which would make them not just realistic, but also more than realistic. And so that's another thing we have to consider when we look at ancient art, especially Greek art. You'll notice in that BBC video that we watched, they were talking about those two bronze statues that were found in the Mediterranean and were salvaged in the modern days. And they contain a lot of elements that are not realistic. You know, they have an incredibly deep groove for their backbone, which couldn't be possible. They have no coccyx bone. Their legs are incredibly long, and so on and so forth. Now, we should ask the question, when the artists are making these things that are more than realistic, are they going against Plato and Aristotle? Because realism is important to Plato and Aristotle, as we've said. Things need to be fitting. Well, I would argue that what they're doing here is in line with Plato and Aristotle's aesthetics, because they're going beyond the imperfect physical human and trying to represent something that's more than human, the form that lies behind the human. Or, to think of it in a modern way, they're trying to represent the perfect human, which is the same thing as saying representing the perfect form that lies behind a human. And so I would argue that everything we see in ancient art conforms to the ideals of Plato and Aristotle, more or less. Of course, there will be good painters and good sculptors and bad painters and bad sculptors, and their ability to produce what is considered beautiful by Plato and Aristotle will vary. But we can see also that there is a focus on proportion and balance, harmony. You'll notice in the video where they were talking about the different way the body can turn so that, half of it looks like it's at rest and half of it looks like it's in motion, and so it's that balance between rest and motion. There's there's an emphasis on harmony there. And even when you look at the architecture as well, if you look at the Parthenon and the Pantheon, which of course those two being so similar, they always cause me to pause and think, which one is it, Parthenon or Pantheon? Anyway, so in both cases, they are very focused on harmony. They're very focused on ratio. In fact, there's that one moment in the Khan Academy video where they're talking about the Parthenon and how the ratios look perfect to our eye, but if you measure it, there's actually slight differences, and that is to accommodate for the fact that it will look different. It will look disproportioned if it's proportioned. So they were even considerate not just of the math. They're not just saying these numbers are proportional, so we'll do it. They saw that it would be disproportional looking if it were proportionate, and so they accommodated for that to make it more perfect, more harmonious. But you'll notice in regards to the architecture, there's a very vertical appearance to a lot of it. And we won't be until later, until we get to the Gothic style, way into the late 12th, early 13th century AD, that we start to see a more fluid form in art. And now let's turn our attention to ancient music. As I said, there's even less music to talk about, fewer pieces of music to talk about in the ancient world than there are examples of art. And that's mostly because music exists in an ephemeral way, such that once it's performed, it's gone, and it only exists in our memory. And before it's performed, it only exists in our memory, or in our imagination, if you want to think of it that way. And people didn't really need to write music down. They didn't really think to write music down through a lot of history, because they weren't really discussing it in detail, note by note. So they didn't need to refer to notes. And also they were performing a type of music that is mostly improvisatory. Whoever is teaching you teaches you a melody, and you memorize it. And it's a short, simple melody, so you don't have to, it's not that hard to memorize. It's not like a Chopin ballade or something. And then you improvise on it, you add ornaments, you add repeats, you vary it slightly every time you play it, and nobody's saying, oh, you didn't play that note right, you played a different note, because nobody cares. And so there's no impetus to write things down. It's only in the 9th century AD that we start to get chant in the Catholic Church written down, and that really is the impetus for writing all music down in Western society. And the reason that occurs is because Charlemagne conquers most of Europe, or you could say reconquers for the Holy Roman Empire. And he wants everything to be standardized. And the only way you can standardize chant is if you write it down and everybody sings the same thing every time. Otherwise, they're going to sing whatever they want, and it's not going to be standard. And so, in a little more detail, but without getting too specific, as I said, the music is all very improvisational in the ancient world, Greek and Roman, and pretty much everywhere around the world as well. It's all very similar at this time. It's vocal or instrumental, or vocal and instrumental. There's a lot of freedom as in how you're going to perform the music as well. So there's a lot less standardization than we would imagine in our own time would be there if we sort of tried to extrapolate backwards. You'll also notice in listening to the music that it's all either monophonic, which means there's only one voice or one instrumental part, or heterophonic. And what that means is you take one part, one voice or one instrumental part, and other instruments play that same part, but they do it slightly differently and you do it slightly differently. So it's all different, but it's all the same basic musical content. It's just varied according to how everyone is playing it. And unfortunately, for copyright reasons, I can't really record pieces of music into this recording unless I'm the one performing it or I have the copyright permission. There's some, fair use allowance, but it's only 15% of a work, and that's really not much to go on, which is why I give you the videos to listen to separately, and then you can sort of go back and forth and listen to them. But in any case, we don't need to talk about anything in extreme detail where we would need to listen to it directly. And by the time you've gotten to this lesson, you've already listened to quite a good deal of music, so hopefully you have just a general idea of the characteristics of it and the character of it before you've gotten here. Well, that is Lesson 4, and that completes Module 1. So we're already 1 week down and 5 more to go. So I hope you are enjoying it so far. And if you're not exactly or completely, then please let me know. And I'm happy to add or change anything that will give you a better experience in the course. I will see you again in Module 2 next week. And until then, have a good day wherever you may be.